Hello and welcome back to another video. In today's video I'm going to be going over all of the items coming in 9.5. So in today's video I'm going to be going over all of the items that have been reworked, as well as the introduction of some of the new craftable items, and finally going over all of the new support items added to 9.5. Okay, so starting off with Sterix, which is basically replacing Zeke's. You craft it with a sword and a belt. Now the thing about this item is that it works really well on the units who scale well with AD, so notably Rek'Sai, Fiora. It's super good at just giving that increased amount of damage if they don't have those base raw stats. However, something to note is that it does also scale really well with health, so if you're playing around the bruises, then they can benefit from it quite a lot. Something to note though is that Fiora already gets the Radiant Sterix from her Demacia trait, so if you're planning on playing the Radiant item on her, then Sterix isn't a great slam for that line. However, I really like this item on Rek'Sai. It feels a little bit of a niche item as it doesn't fit too well in too many of the comps. However, if you're playing around that duo carry with the brawler / bruiser at the front line, not necessarily a bruiser, but just a champion that fits that identity, then it's a great slam. However, keep in mind it doesn't give you any healing, so you want to pair it with some nice healing as you'll have a lot of extra HP, so it pairs quite well with items such as the Bloodthirster. Rapid Fire Cannon has actually been reworked. Instead of just giving you that attack speed and bonus range, you're now getting a little bit less attack speed but some more bonus damage. This makes this item a lot better of a slam, especially on units who don't necessarily need that +1 bonus range, but you can use it really well on those units that you want to give a little bit more safety to. For example, the most common one that comes to mind is Neela, but you can also play it on some of the other champions. What I really like about this one is that previously you just slam the RFC if you couldn't really make anything else, but now it doesn't feel too bad of an item, as that bonus 12% damage is definitely decent. Not a huge rework, but just something to be wary of. Moving down, we have Nash's Tooth, which is the item combination for Zizirot. This is a really good item on some of those backline carries, especially when you're playing around AP. It's really good at burning those components that you don't necessarily want. Pretty much the main identity of this item is just going to be playing around Azir. It has that sweet spot in the middle where if you don't necessarily need a blue buff for just like continuous casting, but you value that extra attack speed on your unit, then it's going to be quite good. Keep in mind that it will get outscaled by Rage Blade if the mana pool is really large. And it'll get outscaled by blue buff if the mana pool is very short. I haven't done the exact maths on this, but I would expect it to be somewhere in that range of around 50 mana to around 80 to 90 mana. And if you value the attack speed, then it's going to be a great slam. Very good when playing around AP, as it gives a pretty decent tempo in the mid game, and you don't necessarily have to play around Azir, as it can be the third item that you just throw on one of your backline carries anyway. Crown Guard is going to be replacing Locket. Now the thing about this item is that it doesn't have a lot of uses. I feel like if you're playing around AD, it's a great way to burn that rod if you just get unlucky and get dropped too many rods. But when you're playing around AP, burning the rod on a Crown Guard usually feels quite good. Usually just save that extra chain for your Sunfire Cape. So I don't know. I feel like the Crown Guard, I haven't really been slamming it too frequently. If you're playing around some of those Targon boards, then the extra shield is going to be, you know, a lot larger, and you can play it on some of your frontline units like potentially Taric or Shen, as they actually have somewhat decent AP scaling. So when that shield expires, they are going to be getting that extra 40 AP, which you know, on Shen gives them a much better shield, and it's good on Taric as well. But I'd say other than those niche cases, it's usually not too good to be burning your rods when playing around AP. Just a good way to burn the rods when you're playing AD. So now Adaptive Helm, usually when you're playing around AP you want that cloak for the spark, but if you have to pick up a cloak and then you natural another one, you feel like you're in a really awkward spot. So to me, Adaptive Helm isn't a great early slam. However, it can be just kind of like a budget blue buff, as you are getting a little bit of extra mana. I'd say the thing about this item is that you're basically slamming it when playing AP, and you get dropped to cloaks. So if you get dropped one cloak, you're playing spark, or you're leaning towards that spark, but dropped another one, then you're probably just slamming Helm. The thing about this item is that it gives you a little bit of versatility, because you can move your units to the front or back row and it changes the bonuses that you're getting, but there's not really too many champions where you're actually going to be doing that every single round. So I'd say the thing about this item is that it fixes your item economy when playing AP, like I mentioned before, as you can burn that extra cloak, but also the fact that if you just don't have enough frontline items, you can use it as a backline item in the early game if it happens to fit your board. But when you move into the later stages, you can sell your backline units. Let's say, for example, you're carrying a Cassiopeia and you put the item on her in in the early game, you can get a lot of extra damage out of that. But then as you move into the late game, you realize, oh no, I've got too many backline items. Okay, I'm just going to put it on one of my frontline items, and it's going to be giving you basically a budget gargoyle. So definitely not an item that you chase, but something that's really helpful for when playing around AP and fixing your item economy. Night Harvester, now this is interesting. It gives you that 12% bonus damage, so it's very comparable to GS because after you fall below 60% health, you're going to be getting 30% bonus, which is actually higher than GS. And so the reason I'm comparing it to GS is not because it has anything to do with the enemy's HP, but because it's a multiplier. You only really want this item as a last item on your main carry, just because it's going to be multiplying and you need all of those base stats. So for example, when you're playing around some of the champions like Katarina or some of the other rogues like Echo, if you already have, you know, the Jewel Gauntlet, the Hodge, and you have some of those base stats stacked up, the Night Harvester is going to be a perfect third item for them. So replacing Shroud, it feels like it's a little bit of an awkward item because there's not too many carries that actually want this multiplier when playing frontline. There's a lot of damages, a lot of the boards are back to front these days, but when you're playing those reroll boards, specifically playing around those rogues, or even sometimes when you're playing around some of the Noxus units, for example, even Darius can use this quite well. Any champion that's going to drop below 60% health and then be able to heal back up is going to benefit a lot from this. Just keep in mind you want those raw stats. So something to note is that when playing around Noxus and you have a lot of raw stats, then it can be quite good. However, if you're only playing around 3 Noxus, then I feel like the multiplier isn't as valuable as some of the other items, as they're giving you a lot more raw stats. But I feel like this item is just going to be really good in the reroll comps and then pretty much unslammable in most of the standard back to front boards. Evan Shroud, it's basically just a spark buff for AD users. Now this is really good when playing around the Bilgewater opener, as you're getting a lot of extra AD. The thing I really like about the change to this is that previously you didn't really want to slam Zephyr on 2-1, however now if you have an AD opener, it feels really good playing around Evan Shroud. You just slam it and then you have really good tempo. Notably, you can move on to some of the 4-cost carries. If they need armor pen, then it's obviously going to be quite good. Some of the AD frontline units such as Fiora and Rek'Sai, they do enough, they do a little bit of true damage, but they're still doing a majority physical damage, and you still have those backline units who are all going to be doing a lot as well. If you can't get a Last Whisper on your Xayah, then this can be good. You just put it on one of your main tanks. Keep in mind that you want to make sure that your units are surviving for the majority of the fight. So usually when I'm just playing around this item, I'm just putting on one of my main carries, making sure that they're not taking first aggro, so it doesn't synergize that well with gargoyles. And then you're just putting your main AD units on the exact same side right next to them. Now moving on to some of the new support items, starting off with Aegis of the Legion. Now it's basically just like a reverse Shroud, but for your own team, giving you a lot of buffs. Now I'd say the thing about this item is that it scales really poorly, just because it's similar to the Jarvan's Flag in the previous set, where you're giving your entire team a lot of those bonuses. However, it really compromises your positioning. So when you're playing around a standard back to front comp, you want to give all of your frontline those resistances, but you also want the attack speed to be on your main carry. Now usually you want your tanks to be somewhat in the middle of a board, but you don't want your main carry to be centered as well. So this item is really good in the early game when you can compromise your positioning. However, later into the game, you're going to have to probably sack some of the value, as clumping can be really detrimental, especially into some of the heavy CC, for example, like the Jarvan ulti or anything else that's a similar identity to that. Something that is important to note is similar to the Randuin's Omen, is you can actually utilize certain champions that move around who benefit a little bit more from the stacking, or not necessarily benefit, but just they're not punished as much. So for example, Challengers comes to mind, as you can clump in Challengers and your Kaiser's still going to be safe dashing around to safety, so that will be fine. Just keep in mind when you're playing your standard back to front comps, I don't really like this pickup when you're in the later stages of stage 4 and 5, when some of those big 4 and 5 cost units are going to be coming out and CCing your entire board. So just that's something to keep in mind. Otherwise, pretty standard item that has pretty good power levels all throughout the game. Now with Banshee's Veil, this is basically just giving your main carry a free QSS without actually having to have that as your item. So when you're playing around some of those reroll boards, for example, the Warwick, when you get the Augment, if you're playing Warwick carry, then he wants a QSS. If you want to get 4 items in your Warwick, this is exactly how you're going to do it. Just keep in mind that if you're only really getting 1 carry to benefit from the QSS, then you have to keep in mind, is it worth essentially playing down a gold Augment just to get 4 items in your on your carry? I'd say with Warwick reroll it definitely is, but if you're going to be picking up Banshee's Veil for any of the other comps, you really need to question that, as most of the time you're only really going to be getting value out of like 1, maybe 2 units anyway. So just keep that in mind, as usually QSS isn't super valuable in a lot of the boards. However, in some of the boards it's extremely valuable. Another thing to note is that this item scales really well, pretty much the opposite of Aegis, as I was talking about how the CC only really comes later into the game, so I wouldn't pick this up on 2-1, but maybe in the later stages of stage 3, going on to stage 4, it can be quite useful. Crest of the Cinder is not too much to talk about. If you really desperately need anti-heal, pretty lobby dependent, then of course pick it up. If you don't think your item economy will allow you to get towards that anti-heal at some stage, then it's quite good. Similar to Banshee's Veil, it scales better as it does a percentage true damage with the burn, as well as the fact that anti-heals are only really important in the later stages of the game. Something else to note is that because it's similar to a Zeke's, all of your units are going to be attacking the same unit applying that anti-heal, so it's usually better if you can play it on some of the units that move around a little bit more, some of the melee champions, as well as Kai'Sa dashes around chasing her target. You can get a little bit more value out of it there. Virtue the Martyr. Okay, so this item is really good when you're playing those store boards, really good in bruises. Just keep in mind that you don't want your main guy dying too quickly, but you also don't want him dying too late, whoever the item holder is, so usually just position him a second to the right as you want him dying, usually after that 10-second mark. If you lose a bonus after around 20 seconds, the fight's pretty much decided anyway. You just want to be getting that maximum value, of course. Really good in the store boards, although keep in mind with this item is if you don't have a strong enough front line, yes, it does actually aid in the sense that it's supplying you that extra front line, but you still want to make sure that you have those good items for the frontline units, because you're healing as a percentage. Items like Warmogs are going to be super valuable to keep your front line alive. There's not much point in having this item active and giving that 14% bonus health regen if it's just going to be on your back line. So I'd be picking this item up when you need the extra front line, but also when you know that you can eventually get to a point where you're picking up some of those defensive items, as they synergize really well. I feel like Chalice doesn't have that much of an identity this set. It did get changed slightly, so now instead of only 3 units, you're getting 5 units to get that extra AP. But the problem with Chalice is that when you're playing around the AP lines, you're getting a lot of AP anyway. So for example, with a Sorcerer board, you have a lot of base AP anyway, so Chalice isn't doing anything. When you play around the Invoker line, it can be decent. However, when you're playing Invoker, you're usually leaning towards Karma for the majority of your game, and Karma is going to be benefiting anyway from her Ionia trait, which is giving her extra AP, and you're usually going to be putting 2 to 3 rod items on Karma. If you have a Rabadons or an Archangel on Karma, then the Chalice is going to be doing next to nothing. And if you have Gunblade plus your Gauntlet, then she's going to have a decent amount of base AP anyway, and that bonus 18 it just isn't really doing too much. That being said, if you don't have the too many rod items on your Karma, then the extra AP can be somewhat beneficial to the rest of your backline, as when you're playing around Invokers, you usually can get 4 to 5 units in the backline. But I'd say there's not too many boards that can actually benefit too much from Chalice, so it's definitely not a support item I'm going to be picking up that much. The Locket is back, and it is actually back to 5 units instead of just 3. Now, very similar to Virtue of the Martyr, you pick this up when you need extra frontline. However, what's different about this item is that it gives you a flat shield, so it's going to be very beneficial at all stages throughout the game, as well as the fact that when you're playing around the Bastion line, it synergizes really well because of that extra stats that you get at the start of the fight, and the fact that the Locket shield actually scales with your armor and magic resist. It also does quite well when you're playing around the Targons, so I really like this item when I'm playing around Shen Taric +1 Targon. Usually feels quite good. It's really good at aiding the fact that you have a lack of frontline, as unlike Virtue, you don't necessarily need to have all of those strong frontline items, just because the shield is going to be flat, and you're also getting those base resistances. It can be quite decent in the Bruiser line, because the Bruisers lack the armor and magic resist, although that being said, you're not usually lacking the frontline in the Bruiser comp because you're a store board anyway, so I'd say Virtue usually outscales Locket, but Locket's more consistent throughout the game. Needlessly big gem. Now they changed this up because you don't actually get bonus damage based on your gold. I believe this stat here is wrong. It got nerfed down to 30% bonus damage as a flat rate, doesn't scale with your gold at all. The good thing about this item is that you can actually play tempo now, push levels, and it doesn't matter if you don't have that much gold, because you're going to be generating it from your extra units surviving to that 15-second mark. I really like this pickup on 2-1, however, because it is an econ augment, it doesn't scale super well in the later stages. I'd only really be picking this item up at 3-2 or later if you are high rolling, and you're basically playing for fast 9, you have a super strong board, everything upgraded, and you think you can still continuously proc this gem. And I don't really like picking it up on 2-1 if I have a really weak opener, as you're obviously not going to be getting that bonus. So usually just play this item with tempo, but just keep in mind that you don't need to be holding on to that extra gold to get the bonus ascension value. Cleave hasn't really changed, you get a little bit of extra stats, but nothing really major there. Same goes for Randuin's and Shroud. Shroud's just a support item, you can't craft it anymore. Zeke's has actually changed slightly, you get an extra 2 units with the attack speed as it now hits 5 units. The problem with Zeke's is that it's usually quite hard to get that extra attack speed value on 5 units. You usually only want it on, let's say, 2 to 3. So most of the time I wouldn't really be picking up this item, as if you're playing around an attack speed based comp, you usually just take the Rage Blade anyway, and then you definitely don't need the Zeeks. There was one bullet I managed to craft with Zeeks, which is actually quite good. I was playing scoped weapons, and it actually felt quite good because I was playing around 5 different pretty decent carries in the backline, and just giving that extra attack speed to all those units who are going to be attacking so frequently with the scoped weapons actually felt quite good. But most of the time I'd say Zeeks doesn't have a great spot in the current meta. Zeva hasn't really changed, and ZZ Rot neither. I think ZZ Rot now spawns at the start of the fight, but it doesn't really change too much, to be honest. The only thing is you can't take parting gifts and exploit that. And that's pretty much everything you needed to know about the new items coming in 9.5. If you liked this video, make sure to leave it a like and a comment to let me know what you guys want to see more. I am going to be doing a lot more content creation in 9.5, so subscribe and stay tuned to see more of that.